Welcome to Europe Explained, brought to you by the Council of Europe. This podcast series offers a unique window into what we're doing to create a fairer, more democratic Europe. Through conversations with experts and frontline workers, we bring you closer to the issues that matter, from fighting discrimination to upholding human rights, from defending democracy to building laws, systems and institutions that are just, fair and open to all.
Welcome to this new episode of Europe Explained, the Council of Europe's podcast that highlights the work on the Council of Human Rights, democracy and the rule of law. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the cost of living. I'm joined by Aoife Nolan. Hello.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for being here. You are the head of the European Committee of Social Rights, which is the monitoring body of the European Social Charter. Aoife Nolan, can you please tell us a few words about this committee and your work on the cost of living?
Absolutely. So as you said, Laura, I'm president of the European Committee of Social Rights. We're a human rights monitoring body. We're a group of 15 independent experts elected by the Committee of Ministers to monitor state efforts to implement their legally binding obligations under the European Social Charter, which is this international European human rights treaty that focuses in on rights that link with human survival, development and flourishing. So rather than looking at things like, say, the right to life or the right to freedom of torture, which are covered in the European Convention on Human Rights, we look at the right to social security, the right to housing, the right to protection from poverty and social exclusion. And we do it in two different ways. The first way is through a state reporting process, which we'll probably come back to during the course of today's interview, where we look at states provide us with information and we come to conclusions as to whether or not they have been acting, whether or not they are in line with the Charter's requirements under certain rights or not in line with them. And we also have something called a collective complaints process, where trade unions, employers' organisations, international NGOs, and in some cases national NGOs can bring complaints to us asserting that Charter rights aren't being given effect to at the national level, and we can make decisions on those in which we indicate to states, well, yes, we think you're in violation of the Charter. So these two main mechanisms, reporting and the collective complaints process, all being overseen by this independent body of experts.
And so you've just published a big report on that talks about the cost of living. We'll come back to it. But so there's always been poverty across Europe. But when do we start talking about a crisis?
I think that's such an important point. And I think when we talk about the cost of living crisis for the purposes of the report, we are talking about the fact we're talking about a period, particularly really from the beginning of 2022 on. In February of that year, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which severely disrupted global markets, sending energy and food prices soaring as a result of speculation in food and energy as key commodities. And what's striking there is that, of course, this contributed hugely to spikes in inflation, spikes in prices for essentials. But it happened against a backdrop where, in fact, we were already seeing an increase in cost of living globally. And of course, for us, the cost of living crisis, which really, we were absolutely at the heart of by summer 2022 here in Europe, this follows on in short succession from the COVID-19 crisis. And indeed, state responses to the cost of living crisis were very much shaped by the ongoing lingering effects of the financial and economic crisis, which we saw in the late 2000s. So it's not a freestanding crisis as such. But for us, we really focus on it from the beginning of 2022 onwards until really, I suppose, towards the middle of 2024, when we saw inflation levels dropping. But of course, even now, even though we've seen this, drop from these, hugely heady heights of 18% inflation in terms of fuel and gas prices between 2021 and 2022 across Europe. We're not seeing that anymore, but we are still seeing increasing prices of essentials creeping up. And we have a situation where, of course, prices of essentials haven't gone back down to what they were in 2021. So people are very much, the crisis may be over, but in fact, people are still living with major challenges in terms of cost of living across Europe.
And so that's what your report talks about. I mean, one of your observations was this crisis has had a wide range of direct and indirect impacts that are ongoing. What are your key findings in this report?
So with the report, and the report is quite an interesting one because here it's a new kind of mechanism, a new kind of process for us. Instead of carrying out an assessment in the way that we have traditionally done with states when it comes to state reports, here we're doing something called, we're looking at states' ad hoc reports. And under this procedure, we are seeking to look at the cost of living crisis as a very serious, transversal, pan-European problem. But instead of saying to states, you're in conformity or non-conformity, our aim is to provide a general overview of the impact of the cost of living crisis on charter rights, to provide examples of good practice and also not so good practice in terms of government efforts to tackle the cost of living crisis, but also to provide guidance and recommendations to states, both for now, but also so when we face into future cost of living crises, states can make sure that they are taking action in line with what the Charter requires.
So you were talking about good practices. Do you have examples across Europe?
The review, which is based on the information states have sent to us and also third parties like civil society organisations, trade unions and national human rights institutions, the report focuses on a number of key areas. Social protection, work, energy and food, housing, and the position of groups that are particularly at risk of negative impacts of the crisis. So, for instance, if we take an example of a key challenge that was faced in the context of work rights was the fact that the minimum wage really in many countries lost its real value which essentially means that you could no longer use it to, for instance, buy what you would previously been able to buy with it, which of course directly impacted on people's ability to meet their own essential needs. But we see, for instance, in some states, we saw really effective, very prompt, timely indexation of the minimum wage to the cost of living. So taking steps to make sure that the minimum wage rose in response to the cost of living. And we saw that, for instance, measures that allowed for that, for instance, in Belgium. And in France, for instance, we see an automatic adjustment of the statutory minimum wage is mandatory when the consumer price index reaches at least 2% compared to the index observed during the previous period under study. And we saw that being applied in 2021, 2022 and 2023. And that was really important in ensuring that your take-home pay, that workers' take-home pay was able to buy what they needed as the cost of what they needed increased significantly.
And one significant example in your report was Latvia, because the government raised the minimum wage by 24% in January 2023 and by a further 13% in 2024. I know Germany is a good example too. I think it was 15% raise in January 2023. Have all these measures helped?
I think all these measures have helped. I think the Latvia example is fantastic in terms of the increase that was put in place in 2023. But of course, already at that point, that would have meant where there was, 2023, when we considered that the cost of living crisis was very much in place from the middle of 2022 on, one of the things that's important isn't just that wages go up, but that they go up quickly.
If these measures that seem significant on paper have really helped in this crisis?
I think that's a very important question. You can have measures that look fantastic on paper, but in fact they're implemented in a way that means that their impact is somewhat reduced. I think when we think about, say, the indexation or the adjustment of the minimum wage, or indeed benefits in the context of social protection, it wasn't just about whether benefits or the minimum wage went up, but when it went up. Was it going up as soon as the problem became clear in the summer of 2022, or was it going up much, much later? At which point, fine, it was wonderful that it had gone up. But of course, there had been this period where people and households were under huge pressure in terms of being able to access food, energy, etc.
And if you're already in debt, it helps, but it's maybe a bit too late sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think what you're connecting with there, Laura, is that the cost of living crisis obviously did not affect everyone equally.
So which are the most vulnerable groups?
So I think if you were to look at the impact of the cost of living crisis, there's a huge range of groups that were affected. We in our report, and to a large extent this was based on information that states had provided, focused in on 4 key groups. We focused on children, we focused on people with disabilities, we focused on older persons, and we focused on low-income households. We were also very conscious, and it's reflected in the report, that the cost of living crisis had a particularly negative impact on women. If we think about factors, for instance, with women, such as the gender pay gap, the gender pension gap, and the fact that women still disproportionately carry out unpaid care work, women, frankly, had fewer resources. They were less able. They had less resources to draw on when the cost of living went up. In the same way that, as we've seen with every single crisis, whether it be COVID, whether it be the economic and financial crisis, whether it be the climate crisis, which we'll be living through to an ever greater degree, it is the groups that are already doing badly, the groups at the hard end of society that do worst in these crises. And that's why in our report we emphasise very strongly the importance that governments focus on these groups. They look at who is hurting hard, who is hurting the most. They think about, governments must, have processes in place to measure who's being hurt to the greatest extent, and they must have mechanisms in place that means that they can quickly adopt measures targeted at those groups to mitigate and to reduce the negative impacts of crises on them, including a cost of living crisis.
And you gave a few examples of good practices. Do you have examples of bad practices across Europe, maybe? Not necessarily countries, but measures that haven't really
I think that one of the things that we saw with regards to measures was, for instance, even where you had very positive measures, very progressive measures that made a difference, many of them were time limited, and they finished before the impacts of the cost of living crisis had finished. And I think that that's something that we need to think about very carefully, that when you have responses to a crisis, it can't just be for the immediate wave of horror created by that crisis. There also have to be solutions in the medium and the long term. And indeed, one of the key findings of the report was that, of course, when we look at, say, social protection systems, or we look at systems that deal with, say, food poverty in particular, we see that with food poverty, for example, there's in many countries a reliance on measures of last resort, food banks, etc. Whereas in fact, what needs to be happening is the institution in the medium and long term, the establishment of institutions, of systems, of processes of support that are there for people in good times and bad, and that can then be revved up when it comes to the crisis. It isn't about intervening in the short term to deal with a crisis as a once-off. Because, as you said, as you set the scene earlier on in your comments, these crises aren't once-off. Poverty has been with us. It is ever more entrenched by crises, but it is not something that goes away.
And so what about housing?
I think housing is a particularly interesting example, because we were already living through a housing crisis in Europe prior to the cost of living crisis. But there's no question but the cost of living crisis has turbocharged that. And we certainly saw some of the factors that have led to the housing crisis: a lack of an inadequate supply of social housing, deregulated housing markets, the use of the private sector to satisfy housing needs, a lack of adequate protections against eviction, including market evictions. Really, these have come to the fore in the context of the cost of living crisis. They've made the effects of the crisis much more severe. And they've also increased the risks that people have faced in the context of the crisis. And one of the things that we have recommended very strongly in this area is not just you need to increase housing benefits to meet the needs of people in the context of increased rents, but of course that's important. And it's not just about capping rents or making sure rents are affordable for the purpose of the cost of living crisis, but actually it's about dealing with the massive long-term systemic shortcomings in housing supply and quality that we see across Europe. So our recommendations here are very much this is what you need to do in the immediate context, but actually they also need to be done for the future, because what we see happening in the area of housing was a more extreme version of what we were already seeing, and in fact are continuing to see post the most severe period of the cost of living crisis.
And I believe your report also shows that housing is what we spend the most every month, rent.
Absolutely, and everyone requires housing, absolutely. So, and we saw states taking, very significant efforts. We saw eviction moratoria, we saw rent caps, and that's marvellous. And it's great to see those emergency measures, as it were, but they tend to be crisis specific to the time of the crisis. And what we need is a rethinking and a repurposing of our housing system beyond the crisis context to ensure decent housing for all across Europe.
This isn't the first report you've released, but what changed in this report particularly?
So I think with this report, for us, it's certainly not. It is the first kind of review of this, of its nature, that we've produced under this new system. This overview, together with guidance and provision of examples of good practice. But certainly we've been looking at states' performance with regard to their charter obligations for many, many years. That's absolutely right. And what we see here is that this is the first time we've looked at this issue of cost of living crisis. It's the first time we've looked at the issue of inflation, reductions in purchasing power. And I would say that something that has come out of this as a thematic area, a new thing that we have looked at particularly, has been the question of energy. And it's not surprising that it won't be surprising to you, Laura, or to any listeners, that of course access to energy is becoming an increasingly challenging issue for people across Europe in the last few years. And we, in this report, make very clear, highlight the particular challenges that people faced in terms of access to energy as a result of this huge increase in prices. And we've been doing work recently, which is reflected in the report, that makes very clear that stable, consistent and safe access to adequate energy is both a prerequisite and a key element for the enjoyment of charter rights like housing, protection of health, the rights of family, rights of older persons, children. Basically, you cannot enjoy these rights if you don't have access to, if states and governments don't ensure stable, consistent and safe access to adequate energy. And this report is very important in making that link, and also making clear how, if you don't ensure that, what the implications of that are for the people, again, at the hard end of European society.
So is energy the priority right now? Because what else do states need to do to go further and avoid this the heat or eat dilemma that we've been facing in a lot of countries since the war in Ukraine?
I mean, I think that with regards to energy, again, we've seen energy prices to some degree have gone down. And in one way, we've gone from how do we go from these temporary measures that mean that people can pay their bills to dealing with, the fact that we have the cost of living crises exacerbate disproportionate impact of climate change in marginalised communities, because rising energy costs limit their access to clean, sustainable energy sources. And one of the things that we talk about in the report is the need for an equitable transition to renewable energy systems so that we can mitigate climate impacts and reduce the financial burden on disadvantaged groups. So what I would say is it's not the only issue. I mean, social protection, work, housing, these are fundamentally important, and the review deals with them. But I think it's very significant that the review makes the connection between not just about satisfying immediate energy needs, but the need for sustainable, sensible solutions taken by states to ensure a just transition in the context of climate change.
Thank you, Aoife Nolan, for coming on this podcast and for your insights.
Thank you very much.
If you enjoyed this discussion and wish to explore more topics, be sure to check out the episodes of Europe Explained. You can learn more about the Council of Europe and its initiatives at our website, coe.int. And don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest updates and insights. You can find us on X, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.